And now I want to tell you about Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It gives you smart creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone, tablet, or computer and helps you distribute them to all the major platforms like Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, and more. Plus, they help to hook you up with sponsorships like this one, no matter the listener size, which will help you fund your podcast. And best yet, it's free to use. Look, if you've ever had an itch to talk and express yourself about a topic you like, there is no better time than 2020 to do so. I've started 2 podcasts this year alone, including this one, and we use Anchor for each and every episode. So what do you have to lose? Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started making your own podcast today. This show may contain explicit language and/or spoilers. Greatest movie of all time podcast. I'm Tom Duncan.
And I'm Dana Duncan.
And we're back again to talk about the movie Big, starring Tom Hanks. So, we'll just briefly take you through a quick synopsis. After a wish turns 12-year-old Josh Baskin, played by David Moscow, into 30-year-old man Tom Hanks, he heads to New York City and gets a low-level job at MacMillen Toy Company. A chance encounter with the owner, Robert Loggia, of the company leads to a promotion testing new toys. Soon, a fellow employee, Susan Lawrence, played by Elizabeth Perkins, takes a romantic interest in Josh. However, the pressure of living as an adult begins to overwhelm him, and he longs to return to his simple former life as a boy. So, first off, question we just ask at the top of every one of these. What is your relationship to this film?
Well, I saw it on video about a year after. This is in the days when we still are having DVDs, or excuse me, VHS tapes.
Yeah, so, DVDs weren't until I was about 9 or 10 years old.
Yeah. So anyway, it's the technology moves fast,
especially in retrospect now. So I remember watching this movie probably, I think, in high school, and I haven't probably picked it up since. There were a lot of things I certainly didn't remember about this before we rewatched it. But I remember describing it and how I didn't think certain elements of this movie were going to have aged well in describing it to Sarah the other night. So, but for me, this is that classic example, what is this movie about? And I have a different version of this, but I've been saying this for years, one of the great paradoxes of life. You can't wait, or you spend the first 21 years of your life trying to be older, and you spend the rest of it trying to be younger.
Yeah, that's about right. And there's a few other ones that I've come up with that I won't get into.
Oh, you're not?
What?
Why? Because they're a little inappropriate?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Fair enough.
Well, it's just, what every guy is trying to do. So,
yeah, even in this movie. The other thing that immediately sprang to mind of, my relationship to kind of the whole point of this film is you trying to beat the gullible out of me. This entire movie is about the innocence of a child not knowing how to be incredibly cynical or jaded, or look at the prism of life through the eyes of experience. And, the amount of times that you pulled my chain just so that, you're going to get a great lesson in life. And yet the entire understanding of this film is that sometimes it's better to have faith and hope in a better world, even if it isn't necessarily like that.
Sure. If you say so.
That's That's not me saying so. I'm saying that's what the film is trying to portray.
Okay. I guess I understand, but I think it's
okay. So what is
to
this
me
film
it's the
about to
grass
you?
is always greener on the other side.
Okay.
You know, he wanted to be a grown up, and then he gets grown up, and now all of a sudden he realizes, you know, being a kid wasn't quite as bad. And I really kind of miss my mom.
I suppose. I mean, I'm not going to fault you on that one. I can see that through this. I guess I looked at it through a different prism of self-examination as opposed to more of the literal version of this, where it seems that you went.
Yeah.
Okay. So, who did you have down for best performance?
Tom Hanks.
Yeah, I don't know if you could go in too many other directions. There weren't a lot of endearing characters, but he had a lot of movement to do for this movie, and I believe this is his first nomination for a Academy Award, which obviously was previewing things to come a few years down the road. But you know, the amount of different difficulties that he had to do, being kind of childish and innocent, yet also acting out through his own nature and being able to convey that so purely at times. That's probably a lot harder of a task than it may have looked.
Yeah, I mean, you had to come across as being innocent without, you know, it would have been real easy to overdo it.
Well, or, you know, yes, maybe overdo meaning caricature, but there's a understated nature to what he's doing and coming across as and making it real.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that, I guess.
All right.
It's a difficult movie to pigeonhole sometimes. And
I know.
You know,
this is an extremely difficult one because this isn't anything that, like, I have a ton of huge emotions for or that evokes a lot of response out of me. This is one of those that lives a little bit more in its legacy a little bit than anything else.
Yeah. I have a hard time thinking of this movie beyond the context of what it was, which is it was a well done movie, well acted and performed with a tight script, and that's it. And really, now that I've seen it again, and I had forgotten most of what it was about, I mean, there were the couple of iconic scenes that were done in it. You know, it's okay. You know, if I'm thumbing through the channels, I'm not going to go, oh, big, I should watch that again. I'm jumping the gun a bit, but of the movies we've watched, this has got to be towards the bottom of where I see this as being significant to me personally.
Well, you're kind of jumping the script a little bit by getting to that point, but I think our rankings will inevitably reflect that. Part of this is, and again, maybe we're just jumping around a little bit, but there are certain elements of this movie that would definitely not be done today. There are sequences of this that might be, the trope gets a little played out, even though the movie's not really that long. Frankly, if the movie was any longer, it probably would have hit like a very lull. And there is a spot in this movie right around the point where he really starts to like hit his stride of playing an adult that it kind of drops off, or at least mellows to this point of boredom. At least that's the way I felt about it. But if this was any longer, it probably would have done the same. And overall, I think there is a good premise to the movie here, but ultimately, I think it's outdone by the one inclusion, and I'll just jump kind of to where we usually finish, is remaining questions. Why did there need to be a romantic relationship in here? It's the thing about this movie that makes the least amount of sense for what they were trying to accomplish and the least amount of plot sense. It plays out like a weird romantic comedy that doesn't age well by comparison, because like even after Elizabeth Perkins realizes he's a 13-year-old boy, she's still kind of like clinging to him. And they're even talking about him in like 10 years coming and finding her so that they can possibly have a relationship when it's a little less difficult. But like, I mean, none of those pieces work in hindsight. You're not going to make anything like that today, and where we have a little bit different feeling on this whole thing, and it's still just kind of awkward.
Well, it's almost creepy. You know,
Yes.
Her reaction is kind of like, oh, I had sex with a 13-year-old. Oh, okay.
Well, I mean, we come to like not care about her character. We think she's like a shrew, and ultimately she's not as bad as, I don't know the actor's name, but her boyfriend starting at the beginning of the movie. And like yeah, and you know, the whole lead up into that where you know, he's acting more childish than Josh to like get that payoff level is there, but ultimately she's not like a redeemable character in a lot of ways, and yet all of this stuff is trying to convince us that she's been made pure by the innocence of a child, or being in the presence of the non-cynical nature.
Yes, she is the company barracuda, the shark. She's gonna eat her, be a man eater all the way to the top. And her pivotal moment is where she's starting to talk business to Robert Loggia. And he just turns and says, have a drink. Have a couple of drinks. It's a party.
Yeah.
That's the turning point where it's like, you know, I know what you are. So let up.
Well, I mean, they even mention it. He starts going through, when she breaks up with, what's his name? He starts going through the list of all the people that she's like stepped on or dated or whatever else to basically hop around the top stratosphere of the company. And so, like, this whole notion or undermining her spirit, I don't know if she was redeemed by the whole situation. Like, we get a tonal change for the last part of the movie that seems to shift in that direction, but ultimately it's still a weird and awkward situation, and she's the one that takes him home, where it really should have, like, the Billy, his best friend, is the one that snaps him out of it and gives him that reality check, and is the one that was supporting him to begin with. After she realizes he's a 13-year-old boy, I don't understand why she's still sticking around and like taking him home and all of the other stuff that's part of this, when it should have been the best friend. I guess there isn't a better word than creepy. It's just a weird storyline that, for me, it's going to reflect in my rankings. It's just one of those things. It was a little cringy.
Well, you know, I mean, life is different now than it was. Okay?
Oh, I know.
And I tell this story, and I'm not trying to minimize it or whatever else. Okay? When I was in high school, the senior guys who were scoring with the freshman girls were called studs. Now they're called felons.
I know there's some level of like stark contrast in that. It's just,
we have, as a society, have decided that there are certain behaviors and conduct that we are no longer going to tolerate, or that we have deemed to be inappropriate. And the fact that we have now had generations of women who have realized that their lack of maturity under the age of 16 gets them into trouble. And so we have said we're going to step in and protect them. In this particular case, the same thing. The number of times that you've seen women, and you read about these all the time now, teachers who will proposition and sleep with their junior high students, male students. And, and it's not, and they go to prison for it. It's creepy at this point in time. At the time it was released, it was kind of cute. Now it's creepy.
Yeah, and I will say that, like, the evolution on a lot of these things goes pretty quickly. Yes, this movie is, like, over 30 years old, but still, I mean, we've evolved a lot on certain social topics in 30 years. In ways in which it took hundreds of years before that. So, anyway. All right. We'll get back into the categories here, but best minor performance?
Robert Loggia.
Yeah, I can't fault you for that one. He is an endearing character in this because he seems to get it a little bit more than any of the other ones. Kind of like working for him, and ultimately that's why he like sees something in Josh. Personally, I went with Jared Rushton, his little friend Billy, who I don't know if he's even done anything past this as far as like acting work, but I think he's kind of like the heart of the movie that kind of grounds it a little bit. And like I said, he gives that moment of clarity or that pullback to reality towards the end of the film. And it really doesn't work without him ultimately. Not only being able to help Josh transition through the whole thing, but kind of like take those steps to like pull him back into what he needed to be to finish the film. So as far as plot devising and the rest of it, and ultimately I didn't think he overplayed the part all that much either. So, we've had some very good kid actor performances since, but I just thought it was good for him.
Yeah. Well, in part, this is kind of, again, one of the climactic moments. This is Robert Loggia, and the reason I'm pointing this out is he was a long-time actor in television and movies and doing spot pieces. And as he got older, and this is part of the whole thing, there was a whole group of male actors who got into their 60s and became sex symbols late in life, playing these parts. And one of the reason I'm mentioning this is the first movie I remember Robert Loggia in is An Officer and a Gentleman. And it's the opening scene of the film where Richard Gere is going to go off to flight school. And he is going to say goodbye to his dad, and his dad is laying naked in bed, bare-assed, with a girl. And the bare-ass is Robert Loggia.
Fantastic. I'm so glad that you're spoiling that movie for me.
Anyway,
God.
And that is kind of a point where, and I remember women when that movie came out I think it was like 80, 81, in the high school thinking he was sexy. He's like 63 or 64 years old at that time. I mean, when he's doing this film, he's got to be close to 70. He acted regularly into his 80s. I think one of the last big films he did was Blake Edwards' S.O.B. But later in life or later on, he did more bit parts because he developed Alzheimer's. and so he started having problems with his memory and his and memorizing his lines. But he tried to work well into his 80s.
Yeah, I wouldn't call that a big final role or movie, given that I have no idea what the hell that movie is. All I understood from that was the title and who Blake Edwards is. But okay.
That's Julie Andrews' only nude scene in the films.
Well, we just upped to explicit rating yet again on the podcast.
Well, it's the entire film.
Apparently, we've turned into the Mr. Skin sponsored podcast.
Well, the only reason I'm saying that is that's the whole premise of the film, is that Blake Edwards is the character is played by Richard Mulligan in the film is Blake Edwards, and he has a bomb film. And the movie theater won't let him have control of it, so he decides to reshoot it as an X-rated or near X-rated fantasy. So he's going to put America's Sweetheart nude in it. And so it's Julie Andrews, who is Blake Edwards' wife. And so she does a nude scene. It has Robert Preston. It has Robert Webber. I'm trying to remember who else is all in it. But
okay, I think we've talked more than enough about a film we're not reviewing.
Just watch it sometime. If anybody's interested, it's worth watching once. It's a funny film because it pokes fun at Hollywood.
Okay. Your most charismatic award.
It's hard. Again, I guess it's still going to be...
It's Tom Hanks.
Yeah, it's got to be Tom Hanks. Because if it's not Tom Hanks, this film flops.
Oh, yeah. He's just got that innocent doughboy look that, plays well, and he can play it so simply yet subtly, and gets the most out of every interaction he has, but everything seems believable. So it's Tom Hanks for me.
In some sense, if you ever, and I don't know if you have, I doubt it, but have you ever watched the short-lived TV show he had? I think it was 2 or 3 seasons. Bosom Buddies with Peter Scolari.
I think you and I watched that. They had reruns on like TV Land, like when we were first having it on, like in the early 2000s. I don't really remember anything about it, but
in some ways it was 2 guys who, the whole premise is they couldn't find an apartment in New York that was affordable. They found an apartment, but it was in a women's only apartment building, so they went in drag to get in and out of the apartment. But most of the film was not that as much as it was the interplay between Tom Hanks and Peter Scolari, who were just 2 overgrown children, juggling, riding, like unicycles, all kinds of goofy stuff like that. And so to some extent, the character in Big is an extension of the character he was in the film, in the TV show Bosom Buddies.
Well, I mean, that's probably reflected in some of his more early work with Splash and this movie and Bachelor Party and some of those other ones where he's kind of like the young guy in his 20s before he kind of like aged into what he was supposed to become in his 30s and his like impressive 90s run. But, a lot of that boyish charm kind of still comes out in there before he kind of like develops into that more every guy role during the 90s.
Yeah, he did several films in the 80s that were, because he did Splash, and then he did Volunteers, and there was another one. And
we can move past it because we don't need his IMDb page.
But all of those films, early films, including Bachelor Party, I thought he was just going to end up for a long time being the cheaper version of Bill Murray.
Okay. I from the amount of romantic comedies and other smaller things, you could say that he was a earlier version of kind of like this. A few years ago, what we had, the McConaissance.
Yeah.
Where like he's a romantic comedy star that's kind of never takes himself too seriously and appears in all of these crappy movies, and then just starts putting together slowly but surely some more serious work until he hits that final one where he gets to the Oscar pinnacle. So
Yeah. I think it's some same degree, ultimately culminating in him playing in Philadelphia.
Well, and then Forrest Gump, Apollo 13, Saving Private Ryan, Castaway, etc. Like, he has a huge run during the 90s. To be fair, in no way do I think Matthew McConaughey is the same actor as Tom Hanks. I want to make that clear. I'm just comparing their career arcs.
Okay.
I like them both individually for different reasons. So, all right. Best scene. All right. Here are my nominees, and you can add any that you wish. Teaching the trampoline.
Okay.
The obvious, his first day in the toy store and playing chopsticks on the piano.
Yeah.
The first day waking up as an adult and scaring his mom so that she ends up calling the police because she thinks it's a home invasion.
Yes.
The toy pitch meeting. I don't get it.
Okay.
And then him showing up in that god awful tuxedo.
Yes.
Any of those that you'd like to add?
No. Those are the biggest scenes available.
Okay. So which one is it for you?
The dancing on the piano. It's the one scene that I always remember.
I'm gonna go with the toy pitch meeting because it comes back around like multiple times during the course of the movie, and kind of has the jumping off point for where that is. Like, I understand that, but I actually have the chopsticks on the piano being one of the two indelible moments categories.
Okay.
All right.
I could agree with that. So if I can't use that and it has to go to the indelible moment category, then my pick would be probably the trampoline. And leading into the trampoline, which is, the line, like a sleepover. Well, I get on top.
You already jumped into the lines already.
Yeah. I didn't know
you were jumping around. You are talking about every movie but this one half the time. Like, where is your focus tonight?
Oh, well.
All right. So, favorite scene?
I don't know. I do enjoy the whole scene when he wakes up and he's big, right down to the point where he pulls open his pants and looks, and ooh, I guess I am big. I mean, it's just comical, him trying to understand what had happened.
Yeah. I have the first day as an adult because it's the shock value. Kind of like any movie where aliens first arrive. That first initial contact meeting is always going to be the one that kind of like sets the tone of everything else. And so, him waking up and trying to like put on his clothes and do all of these other things, it's just, one of those pieces where it kind of sets the tone of the rest of the movie. So,
well, and to some extent, what makes it significant is everybody has that moment. And I'm not talking about that you get, you grow suddenly, but it's the moment where you realize that the safety net of childhood is over. Like the first day you have to work outside of, college, or in my case, law school. And you realize now this is like adulthood, and I'm in charge and responsible. There's a certain aspect of that is about as confusing and bewildering and lacking in understanding as he was experiencing and realizing his body had changed.
Well, so I'll throw this out here and let you kind of run with it. But they had a line or a quoted piece of older wisdom from the show Billions. I'm trying to catch up now. But where I think one of the characters is quoted as saying, "You're not a man until you bury your father."
Thanks.
Yeah. Metaphorically or physically in this case, I suppose.
Yes. And I felt that. My comment is my mom passed first, my dad passed 10 years later. Okay, which is already, as of today, 13 years.
Yeah.
Because it was May 13th of 2007 that he passed.
Was it Mother's Day? I thought it was towards Father's Day, but okay.
Nope, it was Mother's Day.
Okay, so I thought it was June, but all right, my bad.
It was Mother's Day. Anyway, and I made that comment that when you lose your last parent, it is the end of your childhood. As long as you have parents, you have a tie to your childhood. Once you lose your last parent, it's no longer something that you have a tie to. It's now your past. And you get a definite feeling of break in your life where things are just different.
Yeah. I suppose that's true, and that's why I kind of threw it out there for you, letting you kind of run with it. As we've talked about it a few different times, and that's, been made more apparent to me as I've increasingly got older, so.
Yeah.
All right, finally, most indelible moment. I had two, and it's the two that, constantly come up. Because they keep getting referenced. Tom Hanks did a cameo appearance on the Late Show with Colbert not too long ago, doing something with this and all the other things. But chopsticks on the piano, which we've already mentioned, and the Zoltar machine.
Yeah.
I mean, those are the two things from this movie that literally anybody could tell you.
I agree. I mean, it's by far. I mean, when they're showing a classic film, a montage, they always show that clip of the chopsticks is really always in every major montage where they're showing how the range of Hollywood. I don't know why, but it is a classic scene.
Well, I think it's the playfulness of childhood, and again, it's supposed to be this innocent thing, but ultimately reminding us not to take life too seriously sometimes. Trying to do it behind spreadsheets and what's going to be the data analytic driven thing, whereas sometimes you just have to take it out of the box and play with it in order to know its value.
They never really discuss it, but my guess is, or the feeling I get from the length of the story is that Robert Loggia started the toy company, and that it was based on his love of toys and his love of the expression or the love of toys that children have. And somewhere along the line, you get the distinct feeling by all the meetings that they've lost track of what it is, or what their intent or what their purpose or mission is. That it's gotten lost in sales numbers and data and surveys and all this.
Right.
And it's at that moment in time when Robert Loggia lets go and goes back to a time of more innocence and play, that he realizes that the company has drifted beyond what it should. And so he changes the direction of the company.
Honestly, and I think this is possible. The premise is still golden. That's not what we're complaining about. And this goes back to the earlier conversation. The movie shifts tonally when he starts to really hang out with Elizabeth Perkins and they take it in the romantic direction as opposed to his being successful at the toy company. And there is a better movie from that jumping off point where you could make something else and it be about work or any of the other things. But by trying to focus on the romantic relationship, it kind of shifts where the movie goes and kind of loses some of those aspects that probably could have worked a lot better. Yeah. So, all right. Go ahead.
No, we just keep going back to this point again, and I don't, it kind of, I don't know. At times I get the distinct feeling they weren't sure what they had. I think they kind of had the idea originally, and then they're like, well, we need to turn this into some sort of a rom-com or we're not going to have anybody watching it.
Yeah, and that seems to be fair for how they were doing movies, but sometimes you got to let a premise play out instead of trying to change it halfway in. So,
and sometimes it's the studio intervening after the dailies come in, because in the original premise of the movie Caddyshack was all about the caddies, but the studio said no, we need stars in this, so that's where they started adding Ted Knight, Rodney Dangerfield, Chevy Chase, and Bill Murray, because the studio didn't like the premise or the direction of the film and required it to be modified in order to continue backing it. I don't know whether the story of this film is in that way or if they just anticipated that's the direction the studio would want to go and drafted the script accordingly.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good stopping point or a good breaking point for one of our sponsors. We're back. So that puts us at best lines. So I have a couple of different nominees, and we can throw in any ones that you want to put past this. So I think I have 4 here, one of which you've already kind of buried down. But so you got a job where you play with all these toys? Yup. And they're going to pay you for that? Yup. Suckers.
Okay.
Then the randomness of John Lovitz being in this film. See that girl over there in the red? Say hi to her and she's yours. She'll have her legs around you so tight you'll be begging for mercy. Well, I'll stay away from her then.
Yeah.
What is so special about Baskin? He's a grown-up. Yeah, okay. And then this would end up being my funniest line nominee. I'm not so sure we should do this. Do what? Well, I like you, and I want to spend the night with you. Do you mean sleep over? Well, yeah. Okay. But I get to be on top.
Yeah.
Meaning the bunk beds, people. The bunk beds.
Yeah. Yep. That's my vote.
Well, that's mine for funniest line. What did you have for best line?
I don't get it.
Yeah. That's one I forgot to mention.
Because again, that line kind of sums it up. It's like you can have all the study and you can have all the market groups and all this. Ultimately, when you were a kid, Mom and I used to complain because we would spend hundreds of dollars on toys, and yet you were about two and a half. You would sit with an oatmeal box or container, put blocks in it, shake it, then open it up, take the blocks out, put more blocks in, shake it, and you'd spend an hour doing that while all these expensive toys are laying all over the floor around you.
Sorry.
Well, but again, that's where we kind of decided that, spending a lot of money on toys wasn't necessary.
The best toy that a kid has is his imagination.
Until he gets to be about 14 or 15.
Oh, no. Depending on how confident he is in himself, that may still be his best toy.
Okay.
Anyway. All right. So I guess we'll just jump ahead to the rankings. What did you have down for Legacy?
Well, it's a split decision. Yes, this movie has some legs as far as concept, but some of it's so outdated it drags it back down. So I had to go with above average, or because I'm rating this as far as Legacy, not just on the films on the list, but all films in general. So I'm going to say 7.
Okay, so I went with an 8, and it's partly because I have to exclude that part of your argument, because that's an argument for classicness. There are elements of this movie, as you said. I mean, there's depictions and indelible moments that are part of cinema history and are classic. And this premise has been used multiple times over to do different movies all over the place. I mean, I can name probably 3 off the top of my head that are within the last 15 years or 20 years that have or borrowed this premise essentially, but in a different form or fashion.
Actually, this film borrows a premise because there was a film from the 60s with Robert Crane. It was called Freaky Friday.
Okay, but even that was remade.
The mother and the daughter end up swapping places.
Yeah, but that's not borrowing this premise. It's a similar, but it's not the same. Okay. I'm talking directly the premise of a young kid becoming older, or there was another recent movie that the older adult became a young kid again, type of situation, and you kind of go vice versa. So I can think of at least 3 different movies where this thing has been played upon in a much more direct fashion. So I had it at an 8, but that'll average it out to a 7.5.
Okay.
So impact significance?
7.5, 8, somewhere in there.
So I went with a 7. So we'll average it out to a 7.25. On that one, but again, it's probably about the same argument. I think the legacy's higher than any particular impact, but the premise has still been borrowed enough that it's at least much more of a classic trope by this point than anything else.
Okay.
What'd you have down for novelty?
8.
So I had an 8.5, and it's just simply because there were not a ton of films like this at the time, and there aren't a ton of films trying to do these types of themes. So I do think, at least for subject material and some of that, it's off on its own. And then even the parts that make it difficult to, or maybe cringy, there certainly are not a lot of other classic or legacy-worthy films that are playing in the same category. So I guess we'll average that out to an 8.25, but I think that's probably going to be its strongest category, honestly. Okay, so then that brings us to the classicness score, which I have to imagine you and I both had it rather low. But what did you have?
6.
Yeah, that's exactly where I had it.
I will point out one thing. Okay, and I stopped to think about this when the film was getting over. This is directed by Penny Marshall. This had been about 4 years after she had divorced Rob Reiner. Rob Reiner, at about the same time, started developing his own career as a director.
Yeah,
Penny
this
Marshall's
is like
brother,
that big stretch where he starts.
Harry Met Sally. This is Spinal Tap. All films.
Oh, what was he had another big one? Princess Bride. What about this time too?
Yeah, and then The American President.
No, that's mid-90s.
Well, anyway, but it started, and then Penny Marshall's brother, Gary Marshall, who had been the producer of Happy Days and such, crossed over. He had the Coca-Cola Kid. He had, it was not too long after this, it was Pretty Woman and such. And then before this, even, Rob Reiner's dad, Carl, was directing a whole series of films with Steve Martin, from The Jerk to The Man with One Red Shoe to, the Man in Plaid, etc. And so there's this whole group where these two families all kind of interwove. And then you have to add in the fact that Ron Howard was also in this group of all these people that were kind of intermingled, that were all together. And there's a style of film that they did. They were simple films. They were well-written films.
For us to root for him to finally get the one good break that he needs.
Yeah. And to some extent, that's kind of the epitome of his career, because he had a huge problem with addictions to opioids and to alcohol. And it ruined his career. A lot of directors refused to work with him because he was so unreliable, hungover, not show up, lots of stuff later in his career. But he always seemed to be able to pull back. He'd go on the wagon for a while, and he'd rise up. And it got to the point where he was making some movies again in the late 50s and into the early 60s. Then he had a relapse, and then he was on television. And then he ends up his career in the 80s doing Love Boat and stuff. But again, it's partly just the fact that he was so likable that people would give him a chance, even though his history was not the best.
You said opioids there. I do want to try and clarify something, because as far as my knowledge, maybe it's my ignorance, opioids as we currently understand them, I didn't think were really a thing until like the 80s and 90s.
Oh, no. Opioids would include heroin, would include any kind of, morphine is an opioid.
Oh, I suppose.
Morphine addiction was very common. And I think that's where it came about. He was injured in a film. And so he was, of course, prescribed opioids in order to get through filming. And then he ended up addicted.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of the same principle. And I'm drawing, I can picture him. Peter Lorre was a heroin. Peter Lorre was addicted to heroin. And it got to the point where a lot of directors refused to work with him. He really got his break in Hollywood from, because he had worked with, he was a Hungarian Jew who escaped Nazi Germany in the early 30s. He ran to London and worked with Hitchcock. When Hitchcock moved to Hollywood in 1940, and then directed Rebecca, he brought Peter Lorre from London with him. But then after a couple of films, he just couldn't work with Peter Lorre anymore for that reason. And but he went on to still star in several films and have a long career. But it was fairly common at the time.
Even so, I mean, he's in probably two of the movies that will likely be in our top 100, and that's not a bad career. So, all right, that takes us to best scene. I have a few nominees. You can add any you'd like after I kind of go through these. Al giving a loan to a veteran farmer with no collateral.
Okay.
Fred protecting Homer by knocking out the customer.
Yep.
Homer showing Wilma his, weakest moments.
Yes.
Peggy waking Fred from his PTSD nightmare. Bless you.
Yep. Sorry. Tried to hit the sneeze button, so sorry.
It's all right. And Fred visits the fighter plane graveyard. The initial scene where Alfred and Homer fly home.
Okay.
Peggy deciding to break up Fred's marriage. And finally, their first night home.
I like that story, or that scene, but you don't have one scene that I really like and thought was one of the pivotal moments of the film, is him at the banquet, Frederick March at the banquet telling basically his boss to go stick it.
See, it's maybe why I have trouble with that scene, because he's drunk in order to do it, and I don't understand that side of him to a certain extent. I don't buy it as much, which is why I kind of discount Frederick Marsh in this movie by comparison to most other people. But I would agree that it is at least a big scene plot-wise, if it doesn't necessarily work for me.
It shows the internal turmoil. I mean, earlier in the film, and I apologize but this is the film, this is the line, last year killed Japs, this year make money. It's the whole internal conflict that he has about doing what's right versus doing what's necessary. And this was his ability. I think in part he got drunk because he thought this whole thing was a charade, and the only way he was going to get through it was to drink. And then the drink actually gave him the strength to stand up and go, I am going to do what's right, and I'm going to basically throw it in your face. And if you don't like it, well, I'll find a different job, basically.
Well, in the same regard, I will give it some credit, because it's kind of going to the point we made before. They're really only having this banquet or that dinner to celebrate him, when he doesn't make much of his own accomplishment for having just served in the war. And that he should be given this platform because he thought he was doing something that just needed to be done. And, as a result, then you get that scene. So maybe I am discounting it a little bit more than I should, and I'll grant it that. I've just never... I think he works better as the father figure in the movie than that offshoot of the stuff he has going on at the bank. His character is supposed to be adjusting to his family and his family life, and being kind of a surrogate dad for Homer and Fred, and it kind of takes on that resonance, and I think that's where he works the best. But I can credit that scene for being pivotal to the plot point. So, is that what you're choosing for best scene, or were you picking one of the other ones I had nominated?
No, I think the first night home really exemplifies the excitement and the what was taking place. They want to celebrate being home. And that was a key moment. And I do think that that's really where you develop your relationship with the characters throughout the film.
So I picked that for my favorite scene because I think it's the most lighthearted of pretty much the entire piece of the movie, and it's where we get some of the biggest comedy moments. But the one I eventually picked is them initially flying home, and just that initial part of them flying over Boone City and seeing home for the first time, kind of getting in that state of mind of re-entry and all of the complication that comes with it, and even the car ride up to that point of you have to go home, you have to reintroduce yourself into this life, you really don't have a choice. I just there's a lot more depth to this film, but that's really what it was about to begin with, and that kind of sets forth the rest of the movie.
Yeah,
them all getting to know each other and having that relationship and moving forward from that point. So that I already mentioned, I took the first night home as my favorite scene. What was yours?
I guess I would say that my favorite scene was the scene with him dealing with the farmer and the loan.
Okay. Why so?
Because I think it really showed, it was a moment where he went from being what he was before to realizing what the war had done to him and to others, and changed his outlook and his perception of where things would be from that moment on.
Yeah, I can buy that. It does fit well with the other nominee that you made, because I don't think they work well without each other. One doesn't go without, but it does. Gosh, I am finding it hard to find the right words, but give you the certain sense of where his character's at as far as re-entry to the job. I guess. I don't.
Just think about it this way: he was a bank executive. He had to basically make the choice to go into the infantry as an enlisted man, because given his background, he probably had a college education in order to be in the bank in that kind of a position. And so you would almost automatically be an officer. So he would have been having to make a conscious choice that he wanted to do the grunt work, that he wanted to do the stuff where there was real action and not necessarily be an officer. And so that fact in and of itself is significant.
All right, so we turn to most indelible moment. For me, it's the culmination of all three's war experience and how much they felt they accomplished, or how much significance they place on it on a personal level, even if they don't celebrate it. And it's Fred knocking out the customer, who basically is trying to tell them that their service is meaningless.
Yeah.
That they shouldn't have been fighting the Nazis. And honestly, I'm not as familiar with opinions of the time. It's certainly not somebody that you historically get a perspective from in that post-World War II era. I think for the way history's been written, or kind of how we remember it, it seems like everybody was universally on board with the war effort and against, essentially fascism, and taking over the world. And, just by laws of statistics, that's not entirely true. So when you're confronted with something of that nature, where it undercuts something, like when you have a centrally defining moment like that in your life, and somebody's trying to take that out of your identity, I wouldn't expect both of them to respond any less than how they did. And ultimately, Fred, looking out for Homer by knocking this guy out, even at the cost of his own job, it just kind of sticks with you, where that's the final, action of kind of that second act.
Okay, I can see that. For me, it was the point where Homer actually lets Wilma see him without his hooks. I think that is really what all of the servicemen tended to some extent wanted, was to be vulnerable to somebody, but felt guarded in doing so. They didn't want to feel vulnerable to anybody. And the moment he let himself down to that, it opened him up and allowed him to actually love.
Well, and to feel that he could be. I think that's the bigger part of it. I don't think he had a problem with loving Wilma. And it's a problem for all of us, is that some of us just have, I've had this a lot in my life. You don't always feel you're lovable. That there's something wrong with you, that ultimately somebody, if you show them your biggest flaws, that you're going to be scorned for it. And it does provide, again, that certain emotional weight that you wouldn't otherwise see. So, all right. So before we get into best lines and the scoring, we'll take our usual natural break. All right. That takes us to best lines. So I have a couple of nominees. This is one where I'm going to withdraw our normal funniest line category, because, there were a couple of light moments and some places where I laughed, but I don't think this is that kind of movie. So, all right. Millie Stevenson, we never had any trouble. How many times did I tell you I hated you and believed it in my heart? How many times did you tell me you were tired of me, that we were all washed up? How many times did we have to fall in love all over again?
Yeah.
That one does stick out to me in that scene where Peggy's trying to determine herself to break up Fred's marriage, and it's just simply, you sometimes lack a certain level of perspective when you've never been in a full relationship or been married for an extended period of time. When you're younger or you're single, sometimes you don't understand how difficult it is to maintain such a long relationship. So it's a reality check of sorts.
Well, and most people don't seem to understand that there's very few people that you can really be your meanest and nastiest to, because you completely let your guard down with one person, usually your spouse, and that's the problem. I mean, you say and do things to your spouse that you would never do to other people.
Well, it might be a lesson I'll eventually have to learn, but I certainly don't understand it in the same way. So,
well, and you regret it even more than if it were anybody else. But it just, when it becomes, it just happens. It's because you don't feel like you have to put on a persona with your spouse that you do with other people.
So the next one, Homer explains his character arc. I didn't see much of the war. I was stationed in a repair shop below decks. Oh, and I was in plenty of battles, but I never saw a Jap or heard a shell coming at me. When we were sunk, all I know is there was a lot of fire and explosions, and I was on the topsides and overboard, and I was burned. When I came to, I was on a cruiser. My hands were off. After that, I had it easy. That's what I said. They took care of me. Fine. They trained me to use these things. I can dial telephones. I can drive a car. I can even put nickels in the jukebox. I'm all right, but, well, you see, I've got a girl. She knows what happened to you, doesn't she? Sure, they all know. They don't know what these things look like.
Yeah. That is a good line.
Well, it gives his character arc within a few lines. All you'll need to know about where he's going to be for the rest of the movie is in that introduction, and I think it's no coincidence it's in the early stages of this movie. So, next one, Al reacting to Homer's homecoming. They couldn't train him to put his arms around his girl or to stroke her hair.